Now, our third panel of the day brings together leadership from federal politics. And of course, it's a busy week on the federal scene with the House rising for this summer. So we're particularly grateful to our guests. And here to introduce and moderate that conversation is Nicole McAdam, editor in chief of the Ottawa Citizen. Nicole, thank you very much for joining us. We're really looking forward to hearing from you and your distinguished guests in this conversation. I'll turn things over to you to lead that now.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and hello to everybody. It's certainly my pleasure to be with you today and learn about the topic, the experiences of women in politics. This year marks 100 years since Agnes MacPhail was the first woman elected to the House of Commons, but I suspect today's panelists continue to have a great deal in common with her. Canada has a record proportion of female members of parliament, 29%, which is just below the UN target of between 30 and 35% for critical mass. For those data nerds in the audience, that means we would have to elect another 4 women to meet that target. And while a gender-based cabinet is a very significant milestone, the fact is that women, who make up 50% of Canada's population, remain underrepresented in Parliament. So hopefully today's panelists can help us shed a little light on that. Please join me in welcoming them. Karina Gould is Minister of International Development and the Member of Parliament for Burlington. She's the youngest female cabinet minister in history, and with the birth of her son was the first woman to have a baby while holding office. Before becoming a politician, she worked for the Mexican Trade Commission in Toronto and the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Minister Gould. Stephanie Cusey is the Member of Parliament for Calgary-Midnapore, first elected in 2017. Ms. Cusey is a former diplomat who served in Argentina, El Salvador, and the United States during the Harper administration, was a policy advisor to former Minister of State for Foreign Affairs for the Americas, Peter Kent. She is also married and with a son. We have a couple of boy moms here. And Rachel Blaney has served as Member of Parliament for North Island Powell River in British Columbia since 2015. She's the NDP whip and critic for veterans, and prior to running for office, she was the executive director of the Immigrant Welcome Center of North Vancouver Island, and is another mom of a boy. So welcome to you all, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy lives to share your experiences with us. I'll jump right in. So in non-pandemic times, parliamentarians already had 2 jobs, their work and responsibilities in Ottawa and their work and responsibilities in their riding. The pandemic has meant that both jobs were suddenly switched into overdrive in addition to increased responsibilities at home. So I guess my question is, what was that like for you? How did you cope? And how are you doing today? Minister Gould, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Ms. Cusey and then Ms. Blaney.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. Let me just start off by saying I'm really delighted to be here with everyone today, and that I'm joining you from Burlington, which is the traditional and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit here in Canada. Oh my goodness, the past 15 months have been a wild ride, certainly for me, but I know for every Canadian. And I would say that, I've always been a hard worker and worked long hours and long days, but I don't think I've ever worked quite as hard as I have over the past 15, 16 months. And the biggest challenge for me, I think, was just as you said, managing cabinet responsibilities with member of parliament responsibilities, with family responsibilities in a way where there was no transition time. Wake up at 6 a.m. and just start going and didn't stop until midnight, 2 a.m. some days. And for me, what was hard was that for my son, when I was home before, that was home time. And it was time that I could be engaged with him, and transitioning to working from home was really difficult for him. And there were a lot of tears the first few months where he couldn't really understand why mommy was home, but she wasn't available. There was a lot of me hiding to take calls in the basement, hopefully so that he wouldn't find me, which is a really heartbreaking experience to have, which I'm sure many people have had. And then he slowly transitioned and kind of understood. And I have to say my husband was, amazing support and help because, he did so much of the heavy lifting when it came to childcare because daycares weren't open. And my son actually turned 2 just the week before everything shut down. So this was, it was a really kind of trying time in our household, as I'm sure it was for many households around across the country. And the other thing that I would say is that just the sheer level of constituency work, which I'm sure my colleagues can also contest, was astronomical. I mean, my staff were just working so hard with trying to repatriate, the hundreds, maybe thousands of people from my community who happened to be abroad when, the borders closed, helping people transition to CERB, helping businesses access the supports, fielding calls to try and tell people what the latest was and how we could help them. And so it was a lot of work. And I just have to say that my constituency staff, we have small teams as MPs, 5 people. They worked around the clock and were just absolutely incredible. We've all transitioned and it's working now, and I mean it was working the whole time, but because of just so much hard work from my team, who were just absolutely incredible. And I have to say that the one thing that I have been most grateful for since September is the return of daycare, because that has made a huge difference just in our day-to-day lives. But I also understand how difficult it's been for families who have had to have children with online learning and working from home, or having to work outside of the home while their kids are home as well. So anyways, I'm okay. We survived. We're surviving, but it's been a year, as I'm sure it has been for everyone.
How about you, Ms. Cusey?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole. And it's a pleasure for me to be here as well. I'm also currently in the constituency and not in Ottawa for this last week. I would probably echo a lot of Minister Gould's comments. Prior to the pandemic, with my family, it was like mummies in the constituency or mummies in Ottawa. And but I actually found this to be a time of incredible happiness and bonding with my family. I recognize that the pandemic was very classist in the sense that those who were able to work from home, benefited in many ways from this environment of being closer together and of sharing this time. And my family was definitely one of those families where it wasn't a tearful goodbye in the master bedroom at 7 o'clock every Sunday night. Or mummy needing like all of Saturday to recover before getting on the plane again on Sunday. So I think, I for us, the being together was a very positive thing. But similar to Minister Gould, it definitely was the lack of division there between being the member of parliament and then being a mother. There were things that you had to fit into your daily routine that I think all mothers and all Canadians can relate to. The dishes don't wait. Someone has to put them in the dishwasher and unload them. The laundry doesn't wait. And so literally it would be like, put in a load of laundry, take a Zoom call, fold the laundry, take another Zoom call. But, I think this is uniform with many Canadian women, many Canadian mothers, and many Canadians who have the good fortune to be able to work from home. So the time at home was a blessing because I do believe it brought my family closer together. My son, I know, really enjoyed having me at home and more family dinners together. These types of things, walks outside, trips to the playground. But the struggle for sure was just there was literally no pause because of the lack of continuity between these two lives, which we try so hard to juggle, which many women do in our society, which is that of a caregiver and a partner, and then that of being a professional. And I'll also echo Minister Gould's comments regarding just the intensity at the beginning of the pandemic in terms of providing consular assistant. As a former consular officer, I took a great interest in that. And of course, providing supports to constituents as well was very much a challenge. But I think another interesting point is, and I'll also say, I completely agree with Minister Gold regarding small constituency staff. But as a shadow minister, you don't have the support of a department as you might in a ministerial position. But I also think another important thing to remember, Nicole, is the transition we're going to have to make going forward. Now, as we go through the summer back into the fall, yes, we're anticipating an election, but at some point, mommy's going to have to get on the plane again every Sunday. And so that will all, I'm also, as good as this time was together and as challenging as it was, I'm actually a little nervous now about going back to how things were. And I think a lot of Canadians are feeling this, the anxiety about things going back to normal, about mummy's Saturdays and Sundays being filled with barbecues and community activities. And that's kind of more on my mind now is, we got through this time, but when I look back on my pandemic experience, there was fear, definitely fear and concern for my community, but there was also the comfort of a cocoon. And now that cocoon's going to be broken as we go back to what was before. So I guess I'm thinking in terms of my parliamentary duties, the seamlessness will continue of being present and available. But for my family, I'm a little bit worried because I don't know who's going to load the dishwasher now, and I don't know who's going to be there to give my son a hug when he comes through the door at 3:20 and says, "Mommy." So that's more what's on my mind now, Nicole, is the transition back to normal. But I certainly echo a lot of the comments of my colleague. Thank you.
Thanks. I think a lot of us can empathize with those nerves when it comes to kind of embracing life after COVID. Ms. Blaney, how about you?
Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank the Chamber for doing this. It's so important to continue to talk about the realities that women face in all of these leadership roles. So thank you to all the women here today doing the work that they're doing that's so important. I'm here in British Columbia. I'm on Vancouver Island, and I'm in the unceded territories of the Weewakai, the Weewakam, and Hamathko First Nations, and I appreciate them for allowing me to be here doing that work. I think balance is always hard, especially when you're a woman. I have a very large riding, and so not only am I flying across the country, and it's quite a flight from Vancouver Island, it's also traveling all over this riding with 7 ferries, going to different communities and doing that work. So when COVID hit, it was a pretty significant change. And I think, what I remember the most is I actually stayed. I stayed in Ottawa for the first while because I knew new legislation would have to come. I knew something would have to happen with this pandemic. So I ended up as the whip making that decision to stay for the first while and be part of that all-night discussion that happened in the first piece of legislation. And I think when I look at this process, even coordinating. So my son was away at university. And so when we were all coming home, we had to coordinate so that I arrived as they left so that we could quarantine. It was a big kind of all these interesting logistics of getting him home so that we could all be quarantined for a certain amount of time, and so that there wasn't any mixing. It was a lot of coordinating. But I think when we look at this time, I agree. There's been some good time with my family. I'm home a lot more than I usually am, but everybody knows that I'm either in my constituency office or I'm in my office working, and the door is closed. I'm really grateful to my family who I knocked on the door and are we allowed to come in? Here's a snack, worrying about the work that I'm doing and taking it really seriously. I really appreciate my sons and my husband for that energy. But I think what will always stand out to me during this time, of course, in my role as whip, was the negotiation process that happened between all of the parties about how is democracy going to work in a pandemic. And I think about that a lot. When you're in the middle of doing it, you just do the work. You have those discussions, you look at the standing orders of the House of Commons, not really exciting things for most Canadians, but what an important thing that we all had to figure out. And I just really appreciate all the businesses that have had to do the same thing. We worked really hard in our riding with businesses because of course we have a large diversity of businesses. A lot of people were really struggling. For some businesses and some families, the impacts of COVID were immediate. For others, it took a longer time for them to be really impacted. So I think, one of the things I do appreciate about this process, not always, but especially in the beginning, was our ability, all of us in our different parties, to come together to talk about the realities that were happening in our riding and try to create solutions as quickly as possible so that people would be stable during this time. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think this is part of what women bring, is this practical, no nonsense approach to really figuring out solutions. So I think I share with my colleagues as well. What is it going to be like when we go back to whatever the new normal looks like? I certainly have appreciated being able to have a voting app. I often think of families with young children. If you can't be there, it sure makes a difference if you just have to step out for a few minutes to take that vote, but then you get to go back and finish reading a book. I think we really need to look at what democracy is going to look like in the future in this area, because finding that balance is really important. And I know for my kids going through teen years in university, the first bit of university, it's been hard because I was not there to support them. And it really meant that my partner had to pick up that ball, which I think was good. And I think, I will end with this. One of the most startling moments to me in this role was, everybody got used to me being away. Now I'm going to have to ask everybody to readjust when we go back to normal. But I remember, I don't know if most mothers have this experience, but anything happens, the first person that they call out, my kids always would say, "Mom," and they would tell me. And I know that about 4 years into being elected, I was in the house and my son saw something outside and he called Dad first. And I'm really glad that he had that experience, but it was also very hard as a mom to let that go. So I hope that answers the question. I look forward to hearing the next ones. Thank you.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer, and I can also empathize with the first time that your son or daughter, asked for dad instead of mom. That bittersweet feeling. When you think back to when you were first elected, how did you adapt to having to do both jobs, riding work and work in Ottawa from home, like in addition to balancing family life? So, how did your routine kind of change? Why don't we go to Ms. Blaney first, and then Ms. QC and Ms. Gould? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in the beginning, I think most of us will have this story to share. Is we were on the phone all the time. I don't even know what it's like to live in a world without Zoom anymore. But in the very beginning, and I remember being in my garden on the weeding, talking for hours on the phone with all of the different things that we had to do. So that was definitely a challenge because, I think, Stephanie said it really well earlier. It's like when you're home, you're home. And there was a lot of times when I would, historically run in and I would say, "Hi, I'm home. I got to go." But I was actually able to stay home. But the expectation was that I would be there to visit with, to discuss things. And often I was on the phone too much and I couldn't. And I remember, my husband getting frustrated. I think one of the biggest challenges for me as a BC MP is, of course, I'm up by 4:30 in the morning because the world is started by 5 o'clock. I'm already inundated. So, I guess my family has also had to adjust to the fact that I have to go to bed earlier if I'm going to maintain any kind of sanity. So it really has changed those things. So, I think the biggest impact is just that you're home but you're not home, and the decisions that you are making and the work that you are doing have huge impacts on people, and both roles. But this was more of an emergency. Like under COVID, it was like, and I'm sure all my colleagues will share these stories. Businesses and families would be calling your office and it would be like, "I am about to lose everything." And you're like, they're about to lose everything. So, you deal with that regardless in this job, but it was like all at once. And I think trying to find a way to balance out some sort of time with your family when you're in the middle of a pandemic, you're dealing with the stresses already that every Canadian was dealing with, of just not knowing, you don't know when it's going to end. But on top of it, you're really trying to make sure that there's something here to build on. I think that was probably the hardest part for me in that work life balance. Thanks.
Ms. QC?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole. And I'm sorry, I MP Blaney always gives wonderful and complete answers as she does in the House. But I'm sorry, was the question regarding what changed when we first got elected? That was my understanding, or was it in regards to the pandemic environment? Sorry to
The
backtrack
pandemic
to that.
environment.
Okay, the pandemic environment. What changed?
What changed at home for you?
Yeah, what changed at home?
Adapting to
I
this
mean,
new normal.
yeah, I mean, I feel very similar to what MP Blaney said. You know, it's exactly, you were on Zoom all of the time. That was the main thing. And I think just being very aware of your environment. You know, we've at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone saw the funny videos where like cats come in and they, you know, cause havoc, that sort of thing. So I think being aware you were, because I think very much, you know, as elected officials, you're always concerned about your public image and these types of things. So, you know, I give reflection to, you know, well, if that photo's in the frame, what does this say? And if, you know, this picture is in the frame, what does that say? These types of things. Also, another thing I've really learned in this environment, and again, this isn't really, I think, is relevant to like being a mother or a wife, or maybe a woman, but I've noticed it's very interesting. People have very different personas, I find, on camera than they do in the house. And I find I very much prefer to be in the house. In the house, I'm standing and I'm animated and I can, you know, gesture. Whereas Zoom has felt very small to me. I'm like, well, Mr. and you have to wear the dorky headset, which is not a great accessory. But I understand is necessary for the health and safety of our translators. But, you know, for example, you know, Jenica Atwin in the House, she was very unremarkable to me. I just thought she got up and she spoke her bit, but I come across on Zoom camera, she's come across, there's almost like a soft strength or what. She's someone who is translated very well into the Zoom environment. So I would say, you know, time on Zoom, environmental awareness, sort of how your image is. But in terms of, again, being like a wife and a mother and at home, I found incredible flexibility. Again, I mentioned previously that usually on a Saturday or Sunday, you're literally just like motoring around from barbecue to community association meeting to recreational facility meeting. And the fact that you can get on, get off, you know, go to the bathroom, grab a cup of coffee and get back on. I mean, it's been incredibly helpful. And as I said as well, it's been very useful to be at home and to be able to work together as a family. I also have a fantastic partner who helps a lot. But, you know, in our household, you know, mommy drives the home train. And so it's being there has made a big difference. So, yeah, I would say the virtual environment is really what has been the difference. And as I mentioned before, it will take some adjustment to exit, Nicole. Thank you.
Ms. Gold.
Great, thanks. You know, I think one of the biggest challenges or differences is that there's like no division of labor. You know, before when you were in Ottawa, it was very much these are your parliamentary duties. Like for me, these are my ministerial duties. And then when I was in the constituency, these are my constituency duties. And the thing that I found, and I actually like to assert, it was a bit of a shift at the beginning to say like, okay, you know, I'm not just in ministerial mode, right? Or I'm not just in parliamentary mode, but, you know, being able to hop on and do, you know, like start my day at a UN meeting in Geneva and then have a Zoom meeting with, you know, a group of environmental activists in Burlington and then do question period in Ottawa. And there was no division of labor. And so in a way, I kind of hope that, you know, it's not that I didn't call constituents when I was in Ottawa, but your time in Ottawa was so much more rigid and managed because you were, you know, you had to be in that meeting or you had to be there and there was transition time. the other thing that I'm sure everyone experiences is that, at least in my day, like there's no transition time, right? You just go from like, sit down at your desk at 8 a.m. and you don't leave it until 8 p.m., right? And there's no 5 minutes in between meetings. And so it's just that, the kind of having to transition so quickly between those roles, which I actually enjoy because I love every aspect of my job, has been really interesting, but was certainly challenging. And I think from I'm going to feel for my staff and my schedulers' point of view, has been, on the one hand, made their lives easier because they can schedule international and constituency meetings in a way that they wouldn't have been able to before. But I think it's also like, I think I have so many more meetings now than I did before, and my colleagues probably relate to this. And I don't know about anyone watching, but I derive energy from in-person meetings. I find Zoom meetings can be quite fatiguing. And so in a way, I'm not jet lagged, which is a bonus. I'm sleeping in my own bed every night, which is a bonus, but I'm way more tired than I ever have been because I'm just on, I'm just sitting in this box, all day, every day. So that's been a challenge. And then I think the other thing that I would say is that there's been so much collective grief and mourning and angst that we've experienced as a society over the past year. And, I've always been someone who takes on people's anxieties and their stresses. And before the pandemic, you were kind of dealing with it on an individual basis, right? And you could almost more easily solve that individual crisis that was happening. But because we're in this collective crisis and emergency, as Rachel was saying, there's this collective feeling that I think, all of us as members of parliament have likely taken on. And, there are those moments where you can provide those direct solutions to people. If it's a business that's struggling, and you can point them towards the rent subsidy or the emergency wage subsidy, if it's an individual, and get them on to benefits. And those are rewarding because you're helping someone in their time of need. But I think the fact that there's been so much uncertainty with the pandemic means that it's hard to provide that clear response and that clear assurance to people in a way that I would like to be able to, because we just don't know what's happening. And then I think the other thing that has also been really difficult over the past year, and it's not something that's new, but it's something that reached greater collective awareness, which is a good thing, is the anti-Black hatred, all of the collective trauma with regards to the relationship that Canada has had with Indigenous peoples, and the incredible spikes in anti-Asian hate and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and the fact that I think we as a society are reckoning with these issues, which is a good thing and we need to do. But I think it has added to that collective angst that I certainly have taken on and feel an obligation to try and work through with the community and with the country. So, and in a way that's virtual, so you can't come together and have conversations in a way that we would have been able to before. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you for that. I certainly agree that, all of the sort of geopolitical and political or social issues that we're going through kind of adds a layer of angst and anxiety to a time that's already very uncertain. Sort of switching gears a little, I wanted to touch a little bit on what Ms. Blaney said before, which is about the operations of Parliament. During the pandemic, many businesses, including mine, have had to introduce innovations to the way we work, whether it's working from home or new technologies, or in some cases, entirely reinventing businesses overnight. I think about the restaurants that were forced to kind of have takeout businesses suddenly. So we know that government has traditionally not been as quick to adopt to new innovations or technology as the private sector. So how did the way Parliament operates, shift during the pandemic, and how did that impact how you represent your constituents? Ms. Cusey, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Nicole. I mean, the most obvious thing is that it switched to a virtual format. Which it's as I said, I have benefited from this virtual format, no doubt about it. But I really don't think it was for the benefit of democracy or Canadians. There were many other essential workers who were required to be at their places of work consistently, and I think that Parliament could have done that to a greater extent and more effectively. And it will be a transition to go back to the House if it is to be as normal come September. So I benefited from it, but I'm not sure Canadians were as well served as they could have been as well. I mean, there was lots of legislation which was passed to the benefit of Canadians, and we supported that legislation. But I truly believe the pandemic could have been managed better in so many regards, and I won't get into that. But all of these things had an effect on Canadians. I mean, like I said, I benefit from it. You know, hung out every day at my house, Coolio, drank my coffee. But I think it could have been handled so much better from an accountability perspective, from an operational perspective. It's lots of, and even lost opportunities going into the future. I think with the economy, et cetera. Like I said, I understand we're like, this isn't the place for it. So, I'm fine. Canadians are resilient. We'll be okay. But I think we could have done better, both in management and going forward. And let me think about anything else that changed in terms of how Parliament operated. No, because I mean, there was the actual functioning of Parliament, and people like MP Blaney worked very hard in an effort to coordinate all of that. And then, of course, there is sort of Canada going forward, and I think it's from literally 100 steps back from so many other places in the world. So I'm fine. Canada will be okay, but it could have all been managed better with better representation, or a better, more support for democracy. And I think we are seriously behind as a nation, particularly economically, and that's so relevant to this audience here today. And I know a lot of them recognize it, but I don't have much more to say than that, except that we're through it, and so let's go forward. I'm looking forward to going forward, and we'll see what the future holds. Thank you, Nicole.
Ms. Gould?
Yeah, I actually have a different take than Stephanie, because I think what Rachel was saying is that there was a tremendous amount of work done by all of the political parties and the House of Commons administration to take an institution that, quite frankly, is archaic, is stuck in the 19th century, and move it into 2021. And actually what we've seen is Parliament has worked over the past year. Committees have operated, MPs have been able to participate both in person and virtually. The voting app, I think, is a brilliant innovation that saves so much time. I mean, like the amount of inefficiency that can happen in the House of Commons sometimes has, I think, tremendously been improved. And I think about it as someone who, was the first sitting cabinet minister to take a maternity leave, right? I could have voted so easily holding my newborn baby, right? And I hope that that's an innovation that stays into the future. I mean, one of the things that, I was really after I gave birth, I had this conversation with Sheila Copps, and she said, what do you want your legacy to be? Like, how do you want to change the House of Commons? And, for me, it was, okay, well, how can, the next person who is in my role, how can they do this in a better way? How can we be more inclusive, right? And so, in June 2019, in a unanimous consent motion that nobody paid attention to, we actually gave parliamentarians a parental leave. right? For the first time, an official parental leave. And imagine if they had that app, then they could be on their parental leave, but they could still be voting, right? So, like, there's actually been a huge leap forward, I think, over the past year, and huge credit to the whips of all of the political parties, to the House of Commons administrative staff, because they worked so hard to make sure that we could all be participating from the safety of our own homes. And I have to say that I think it was tremendously important that we did that, because I think, first of all, it demonstrated leadership, that we could make that transition and do it in a relatively quick manner. But the other thing, parliamentarians are super spreaders, right? Imagine you had 338 MPs flying in and flying out all the time, right? With no requirements to quarantine and all of that stuff. Like, I think it was really important. And actually, we have been able to pass important legislation. We have been held to account. I mean, from April until May, we had 2 hours of question period every day. That was a long time, right? That was, we did it. And so, yes, of course, can we learn from this experience? Absolutely. And we should, and we can make those improvements. But I don't think going back to where we were was the gold standard, right? Like, I think that we can absolutely take these innovations and move forward. And I hope that we keep the app. Maybe it's not, something that you can use all the time, but in exceptional circumstances, like, let's say you're on parental leave, let's say you're ill, right? And you have to get chemotherapy, right? I mean, there are many reasons. Like, if you recall, I think it was in 2006 when they wheeled this poor member of parliament in on a gurney so that he could cast a vote. Like, that's inhumane. We don't need to do that. We actually have tools that we can make this better for people, so that we can respect their human dignity, and create a space that I think can be a model for how other Canadian organizations can work, and not one that needs to catch up with the times. So I actually think there's been a lot of positives this year that we can draw on, and I hope that we incorporate some of them moving into the future in a way that serves Canadians, but also enables parliamentarians to be human beings as well.
Ms. Blaney, you must have a special perspective on this as one of those party whips. I can imagine you're just sitting there, but, go right ahead.
Well, it was a ton of work, and I just first of all want to acknowledge, and I appreciate, the minister also mentioning this, but the staff and the workers at the House of Commons were phenomenal. So we, did a whole bunch of in the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, had people from other countries, other provinces come forward and talk about what they were doing in terms of trying to make legislatures and other countries run in terms of their systems. So it was a lot of gathering that information. And I do hope that out of all of this, we do take that chance to reflect and learn, because we need to be prepared. I mean, the reality is, if anything, this has reminded us that pandemics do happen. This is not the first one, and that we do need processes put into place so that we can deal with things effectively. So that is something, of course, that I will continue to support. And I also want to say, one of the biggest challenges, and I always wear, it's like I am now trained to wear my headset. I can't stop because of listening to the interpreters talk about the damage it was doing to them to not be able to hear. And imagine trying to listen to what somebody is saying and then say it in a different language. And this is not just interpreting in an event. This is how our democracy works. So if the interpretation is done poorly, it could be very, very problematic. So just really listening to them. I think one of the challenges for sure was the amount of resources that we had. So for example, when we're sitting normally, we can sit all hours if we need to. The committees can sit longer. Because of our limited resources, we had to, sometimes committees couldn't sit as long as they wanted, as we saw in the last negotiation between the whips. Sorry if this is too procedural for everyone, but usually the last while in Parliament, we sit till midnight every night. We just couldn't do that if we were going to make sure that committees were able to meet. So there is those challenges, and I think every business has faced those challenges. But it is a good conversation. I do like the voting app. I don't think it's always appropriate And I think it needs to be discussed. I don't want to make any decisions quickly. I would love to have, the committee do that work in the future. But it is about valuing family and what are our values as a country? Do we want to make sure that when, people are very ill, when people have a young family, that they're able to be there to put children to bed, to take care of their own health or a loved one's health? There's been some times where I really agree we have to talk about the humanity of our process. However, I will say this, one of the hardest parts about being in this system virtually is the conversations that happen informally within your party, but also with other folks in other parties. I can't tell you how many times in the House of Commons I've been able to rise, speak on an issue, and members from other parties will come to me afterwards and say, I heard you talk about that. That's happening in my riding. And that's where we come together to create solutions. And I find that does happen, but not to the same extent. So there is value to having all 338 members together in one place where we're reminded that we're not just parties, but we're human beings and that there are key things that Canadians are telling us they need. And only by collaborating are we going to make that happen. So that part I think is missed a little bit. But there was a lot of work done, and I want to acknowledge all the whips because it was a tremendous amount of and House leaders of how is this going to work, and you, like all of the books of procedures are huge documents. So going through and making sure that we weren't breaking the rules, or how are we going to change the rules to accommodate that without losing that essential process that is so important to democracy. It was a lot of important conversations, and I know that businesses and families, quite frankly, when you're trying to do your job and then also trying to make sure your child is doing their Zoom school day, all of these things had to be discussed and negotiated. So we've all learned a lot, and I hope we take that learning and use it in the best way we possibly can.
I think that segues pretty nicely into my next question, which is, you've talked a bit about the Voting Act, but what are some of the other sort of lasting benefits or innovations to sort of how Parliament works that you were able to implement that you hope to see remain once life returns to a bit more normal? Or how about just sort of in general in society, not just sort of directly related to Parliament. Uh, uh, Ms. Gould, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think we need to have a serious conversation about the voting app and how to enable some kind of hybrid setting for specific circumstances, right? Like I agree with Rachel and Stephanie that I don't think we want to maintain virtual parliament. I think we all want to get back to Ottawa. And the point about those informal conversations, like I remember there was one committee where we were trying to get in touch with someone, and we're trying to coordinate with the Bloc and the NDP and our members, and like in a normal setting, someone would have stood up and walked over and said like, hey, what do you think about this? But like you just can't do that, right? And so that trying to call people, that was a bit of a mess. But so I think that informality is really important. And actually, it's like a lot of things. A lot of business happens in those informal conversations, right? That you can't have in a formal way. But I really do think that what we've demonstrated over the past year plus is that actually we can make accommodations for people, to respond to things that are normal human experiences that would actually enable and encourage people in greater diversity to run. I mean, when I have conversations with, people who are interested in maybe running for office, the number one thing I hear about, and the number one reason why people say no, and both men and women, is because they're worried about the impact on their family, and they're worried about, and it's a real worry. I mean, the divorce rates for MPs are sky high for a reason. And so, I think that acknowledging that there are ways to bring this institution into the 21st century without losing, the incredible responsibility and role that you have as a member of Parliament, I think is possible. And I think that this past year has demonstrated that we can actually do it in a way that enables Parliament to work for people both those you represent and the people that are representatives. So anyways, I think there's a lot that we can do. I'm really excited about it, but we all collectively have to acknowledge that it is possible, and that this past year has demonstrated that.
Ms. Blaney, how about you? What pandemic innovations would you like to see kind of carry forward into the new world?
Well, I have to say that all of these conversations are really reminding me of when I was first elected. And I remember being in Ottawa, and it was very late at night, and I was in my office still working. And I actually had this moment where I was like, this is awesome. I get to work and nobody's bugging me or calling me and asking when I'm coming home. So I do miss that part of Ottawa for me, that there's no competing things. You just get to have the luxury of working. And I think only parents understand how fabulous that sort of feels in that moment. But I think some of the things I do appreciate is I do appreciate the accessibility for witnesses to participate in committee. Zoom has really opened the door for us to have. Of course, trying to get them headsets has always been the biggest challenge, but it really has allowed a lot of people to participate in committees and give testimony that, before would have been a lot harder to get them to participate. So I do appreciate that one. I think the voting app, we need to have some really good discussions about what that could look like. It has worked very well, and I think it's something to have a conversation about. The other thing, just from a constituency perspective, that I've really enjoyed is actually, again, using Zoom to have meeting, especially with stakeholder groups. It's been great because like I said earlier, I have a large riding. I have 11 municipalities, over 20 Indigenous communities. Like, we have a lot of folks here that are spread out all over the place. There is a bit of a challenge with internet connectivity. I will acknowledge that, but it's allowed me to bring together stakeholders who are from all over the riding to talk about key issues. And it's just so effective and quick. Whereas before, I would have to go to this community, meet with that small stakeholder group, go to this community, meet with that. So I like that, because not only is it helpful for me, but it also builds awareness across the riding about how impacts are affecting people differently depending on the community that they live in. I was in Ottawa for a short period of time in November and December last year, and at 10:30 at night, I had a town hall. So 10:30 in Ottawa, 7:30. So I mean, that is the benefit of being in BC, is I get to call people or do meetings really late if I have to, just because of the time difference. So I think that is some of the things that I will take for sure. But I do have to say, a lot of respect for the fact that we have a country with several time differences. Trying to make this work has been really a challenge. And I see people in BC where it's midnight, in Ottawa, it's 9 o'clock at night there, but it's later if you're over in Halifax. So I think that is one of the challenges that is hard, because when we're all in one time zone, it does make a huge difference. So, like I said earlier, I think we need to look at the innovation, how we've used it, and have meaningful conversations about what we're going to do moving forward. Because the other thing, before I end, is just, I look at some MPs who've had a huge crisis in their riding, and they just need to be with their folks. And I think there has to be, hopefully, some discussions about what can we do when somebody's had a flood, had a terrible act of violence. They need to be in their riding doing that important work, but we don't want to say they can't participate at all in Parliament, because they're doing very important work for our country.
Mhm. Ms. Kesey, is there anything that you would like to see kind of continued into the post-pandemic world?
Yeah, again, I think we've had a different approach than the government recently, and we have a rotation whereby you spend like 1 week a month in Ottawa. And I'm happy because it means I get to eat at the Rideau Club and go to Society Salon. So if any of you out there ever see me at the Rideau Club, please be sure to come over and say hello. I've enjoyed the 1 week in Ottawa because I feel as though I'm still there. I still get to, make the statements and get the clips. and yet still have that time at home. Like I've been elected for 4 years now, since 2017, and those spring sessions when you're sitting 5 weeks back to back to back, like you come home Friday night, you basically sleep till you get on the plane again Sunday evening. Like the quality of your family life does suffer incredibly. So I'm fine to keep all of to keep some thing of all some aspects of all of this, but I do have two comments relative to it. One is there is always the fake public reason for doing something and the real public reason for doing something. And I think that people on this call should be cognizant of that. Everyone on this call is a smart business person. You can smell what passed the sniff test and what doesn't. So I think, just think about that going forward. And secondly, that the toothpaste is out of the tube. You can't shove the toothpaste back in the tube. And I think that's the way this is with both the virtual format as well as the voting app. As I said, I personally, I'm fine, like getting on an app wherever I am and authenticating and, putting my phone down and like hitting a send. But it's really, are Canadians really served by that? I don't think so. I really don't. Like I said, don't get me wrong. I'm enjoying making dinner most nights, and I'm enjoying that I can be in my backyard and vote. I'm not sure if retaining that entirely is best, but I don't even think it's a question. It's out of the box, and it's not going to go back. There will be some virtual aspects eternally going forward, and it's in totality, it's not a good thing, but I think in many ways it is a good thing. Thank you, Nicole.
Sure thing. So just being mindful of the time, I'm going to go to a couple of questions from the audience, and I'll just encourage whoever feels who wants to jump in can just go ahead and jump in. So this is a question from Julie Lawler, who is asking whether you have experienced a rise in misogyny or hate speech during the pandemic. We know that this is an issue that women in politics have had to face, and whether the pandemic has kind of made the trolls come out from under the bridge a little bit more.
I'm happy to start. I know all of us have had this experience. I always reflect on when I first ran in 2015 and how many people would say to me, well, are you tough enough? And I'd say, well, what does tough mean to you? Like, tell me what it means and I'll tell you if I'm tough enough. And people could never define what that is, just tough enough. And I think that is a misinformed reality. Women know we're tough enough to handle almost anything, especially if you are a mother. There's not much that you can't deal with when it comes at you. But definitely, I've seen that. And I find it really frustrating when your gender and who you are as a human being becomes the important part to talk about, not the work that you're doing. And so I think it's important for not only for us to speak out against it, but for everyone who sees it to address it. I've really appreciated some constituents who've seen that on social media and immediately said, like, what does that have to do with this action? And I really think that when we look at this, all of us have to stand up against it immediately when it comes to any kind of discrimination, whatever that looks like, if it's misogyny, if it's racism, if it's ableism, if it's ageism, you must stand up and say, I see what you're doing. And I really appreciate the people who do that. But definitely I have. And I think it is something that we should reflect on, is that when things get scary and bad, why is it that we have to find somebody else to get after? Like, why is that our first? And I see that all the time too, where people will say, well, I need this, they get this, whoever that group is, why is that happening? Instead of saying, I want all of us to get this. And so that's why I fight hard for things like pharmacare, because I want to stop that fighting. I want people to understand we should all just have those basic things taken care of so that we can live our best life.
Yeah, I'll jump in next. I mean, I think part of it is, I've certainly seen a rise, but it's not something that's new because of the pandemic. I mean, it's been increasing over the past number of years, and if anyone wants to read the comments on most of my Twitter posts, then you'll see it. But I think what's more concerning for me is that as people, I said this in my previous role when I was Minister of Democratic Institutions and, dealing with cybersecurity and elections, but like as people live more of their lives online, they don't see the difference. Like there's no blurring between the online or there's no separation between the online and the offline world. Like it is just one, right? Like that's it. And I think we have to take very seriously that harmful content and hate speech actually that we see online, and we shouldn't be saying, oh, it's different because it's happening online, and not taking those threats seriously, because I think we've actually seen how they play out in the real world with devastating consequences. And I think we all have a role to play in standing up against misogyny, against hate, but against anti-Asian hate, against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and anti-Indigenous racism. I mean, and also what I've been seeing too, which I find very concerning this Pride Month, is the attacks on the LGBTQ community here in Canada. And so it's like an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, and we absolutely have to stand up against that. And I think that I remember when we were debating motion M103 against Islamophobia in the House of Commons, and the amount of hateful emails that I got to my office because I was standing against Islamophobia. I took it upon myself to call all of those constituents to basically say, like, do you know what you're saying here? And oftentimes people would say, oh, well, I didn't really mean it. I was just writing it in an email, right? Well, that's not an acceptable response. You can't say or do those things or make those kinds of threats. Like that's not acceptable for the society that we live in. And so yes, absolutely, there has been an increase. But conversely, I've also seen an increase of people saying that's not acceptable. Right. And people who respond to say, don't say this, or, you can't do that, much like Rachel was saying. And so I think, collectively there is a greater awareness, but we can't be afraid. We can't turn away. And we actually absolutely have to stand against it very, very strongly.
Ms. QC, anything to add?
Sure, I'll add 2 points. My first point is it really doesn't bother me. I get tons of it. Like, go back into the kitchen, just everything. I could care less. Like these people, they're not my family. They're not my friends. They don't know who I am at my core, my values. Even popular opinions the people they don't know me. So I really could care less what anyone says about me on social media. And I think that's a place where if you're going to be an elected official, Rachel talked about being tough enough. Like you have to be so confident in yourself and your values and your convictions. And a lot of times, like I said before, the real story never comes out, whether it's the media or your opposition. On either side, the real story never comes out as to something you say or vote for or what happens. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing is everything my colleagues have said here is true about how this is unacceptable. But I'll also add any of these things should never be used as a political tool or an excuse. And we saw this, for example, with the Prime Minister's comments about attempting to use Asian hate and racism for not producing the documents for the Winnipeg facility transfer. So, everything they said is true, but I think Canadians, and again, these are business-minded folk here on the line, should be mindful about if and even my own colleagues are guilty of doing this. It's just so fun to play the victim or to not take responsibility and to slug the mud or to point in another direction. And I really think, yes, absolutely everything that my colleague said. But let's be sure that when we are fighting against this negativity, it is from the right place with the right intentions. Because if not, then it doesn't mean anything. So those would be my two comments, Nicole. Thank you.
Okay, one last really quick question, which is, you know, the pandemic has brought with it lots of other sort of physical and mental health struggles. So my question to you is, how did you ensure during the pandemic that you were making time for your own personal wellness, whether it be physical health, mental health, or both? Ms. Cusey, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nicole. I think my family being there for me was a big part of it. I drank a lot of coffee, which I'm still continuing to drink. I think my favorite meme of the pandemic was the baton, where the coffee cup was passing the baton to the wine glass, and it said literally every day pandemic. I totally related to that. Exercise, fresh air, and online shopping. But I like it's no, absolutely. I recently read Celine Caesar Chavannes's book, and she talked about how when she was shunned by the prime minister on an international tour, how she went and bought 2 pairs of shoes at Payless, and I could relate entirely. We're all human here. I think I did the same human things that everyone did in an effort to get through those times, and most of them were positive. They were time with my family and exercise, but some of it was a glass of wine or a cup of coffee as well. And as I said, there were many aspects of this I enjoyed in terms of the closeness of my family, and I am a little nervous about reintegrating into normalness again. But I think I did the things every Canadian did, everyone on this call did, Nicole, both positive and negative. Thank you.
Ms. Blaney, how about you?
Well, I happen to live in one of the most beautiful parts of the world. So I will admit that I spent a lot of time by the ocean and in the forest because there's a lot of that where I live. But I think, it was hard to take time to do self-care, especially when you're getting calls into your office where people are so afraid and they don't know what they're going to do. And so that was hard because it feels like a moment of rest is sacrificing somebody else's life. And so I was really challenged with that. So I've done some things that help me. I'm a huge reader, so I try to make a little bit of time to read. In my office at home, I have a bird feeder right outside the window so that I can look at the birds as I'm in the house doing all of the important work that needs to be done there. And of course, just enjoying time with my family. I missed a lot of time when you're in this kind of role. You miss a lot of time with your family. So it was nice to actually, even if all it was hearing them in the next room doing what they were doing, it just certainly felt really, really good. And I didn't do as much online shopping, but maybe I should explore that.
Minister Gould, how about you?
Yeah, I guess self-care is a bit of a luxury, I think for many of us because we're quite busy. But I'll say one thing that I did early on in the pandemic is a friend of mine called to say, hey, my neighbor has put out like one of those Brio train set tables on the side of the road. I'm picking it up and bringing it to you. And so I have that in my home office so that when my son wants to kind of hang out with me, but I'm busy, he can like just be beside me playing, and that's been really really nice. And then the other thing is yes, Rachel, you live in one of the most beautiful places in Canada, but I would also say that Burlington, Ontario is one of the most beautiful places in Canada. And I live downtown. I'm a 10-minute walk from Lake Ontario. I'm a 5-minute drive to the Niagara Escarpment. And so, one of the things that I don't get a lot of time just by myself, but my son and I have enjoyed, spending time at the beach and going for walks in the woods. And the other thing that I have to say that I've loved is just like walking around in the neighborhood and having like really awkward, social distance waves to neighbors and constituents, and catching up over all of that. But I'll also share a little bit of Rachel's reflection in that, uh, you know, I have felt guilty if I do take any time off right now, because there are just so many demands and so many needs. And so it's actually, I think, harder to turn off because, because like I used to kind of turn off on the plane to and from Ottawa, right? That was like my self-care time in a way. But you don't really have that transition time. And so you're just kind of going all the time. And I'm also like, on the one hand trying to support people in my community who are really struggling, but also trying to manage Canada's global response to the pandemic. And so I think that there's a lot going on right now, so it feels a bit hard to do that self-care. But certainly just all of the time that I've been able to spend with my son has been such a tremendous silver lining and blessing. And it's hard to imagine had things continued on as normal, which we were used to, right? Like at the beginning of the pandemic, he kept asking me like, when are you going to Ottawa? Like he was like, I don't understand why you're still here. Like what's going on? And then I went to Ottawa last week and he was like, can you stay here, please? Like, why are you going to Ottawa? So that's been like just an absolute tremendous blessing. And we negotiated that when I went to Ottawa, that the next time I go, he can come with me, because he recognizes that that's kind of like, he kind of grew up in the House of Commons, right? So it's like his second home. But yeah, I think just like being able to put him to bed every night, that's been an incredible moment in my day that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Well, thank you. And thank you all so much for sharing your personal stories. I'm so grateful for the time that you spent here with us today.